All right, we're back with Tanya in-depth share, another one. And I do have some look at the Torah Sherm that I need to upload, and it's been a couple of weeks already, so that is coming. That's Hashem. I probably just need to sit down and do it, but for now, we have the Tanya share. Tanya, day comes and a day goes, and you learn more Tanya. And I don't want things to fall too far behind us. We're already by Parak Lamed Gimel, and this share is for Parak Lamed and even a little bit Parak Chav Zayin. So, yeah, let's jump right into it. So in Parak Lamed, there's an interesting line the Alter Rebbe says, which is that he's talking about the idea of seemingly mundane things that people could find that they're not properly doing. He says, like Lashon Hara is one example. The idea of stopping when you're having a geshmaka conversation about someone else. And then he also says, and many other things, particularly in the concept of sanctifying yourself in that which is permitted to you, which is biblical. As it says in the pasuk, holy shall you be, etc., and you should sanctify yourself, etc. He continues on that, and he says even also that also divrei seifrim are chomer midivrei Torah. They're more stringent than divrei Torah. That last bit about divrei seifrim, I'm just gonna say outright over here. There is a thing in shiur and Sefer Tanya where it essentially says that what Alter Rebbe is saying with this is that niglah'dike is kalashas mechaber motulach deiraisa, and so he's saying he's saving face. He's saying even if you're not going to say it's deiraisa, then at the end of the day, it's still chamurim divrei seifrim. That what the chachamim tell us to do is still important. As in, not only that it's still important, but it's even more stringent than a deiraisa, perhaps. Ultimately, you can take it or leave it in the explanation of the Tanya. The reason why I'm prefacing with this is because I'm going to try to focus on the idea of what if Iskafya is taka deiraisa. Can you say it? If you can say it, then where are you getting it from? Etc., etc. Now, I think it's also important to go back and take a look at Parak Chav Zayin, because in Parak Chav Zayin, the Alter Rebbe has a similar line, and I'm actually going to read from a little bit before. It's not too much before, it's still the same line. But this is a Gemara Maseches Yoma, if I'm not mistaken. The Chachamim say that someone sanctifies themselves a little below, and they are greatly sanctified above. This is besides for the fact that they fulfill the mitzvah Torah of Iskadishtem. When you sanctify yourself with that which is permitted to you. And he says, then the explanation of Iskadishtem is that you should make yourself holy. That is to say, even though you're not completely holy, taka, but at the end of the day, you try to live up to the standard. And ultimately, V'yisim Kadeshim, that's the continuation of the pasuk, whether it's in Parak Yudal or Parak Chaf, and we'll get to that shortly, but the continuation of the pasuk is V'yisim Kadeshim, that when you pretend to be holy, fake it till you make it, you'll taka actually make it, and you'll end up being holy. And this is the concept that you sanctify yourself a little bit, and you get very sanctified. So, what I think is interesting to point out in Parak Chav Zayin is that there is a concept of Iskadishtem that the Alter Rebbe is referring to as a mitzvah say that exists independently of this Gemara in Yoma, which says that a person sanctifies themselves a little bit below, and they get greatly sanctified above. And the Alter Rebbe says this is besides the fact that they fulfill the mitzvah say of Iskadishtem. So it seems to be that it's its own point, it's its own vart. Now, I should mention there is a note of the Rebbe on this, and the Rebbe essentially says that he believes that the line of Iskadishtem is from Parshas Kadeshim. It's Parak Chaf Pasuk Zayin, if I'm not mistaken, and this is in contrast to there is also a Pasuk Iskadishtem that is said in Parshas Shmini, if I'm not mistaken, and it's at the very end of Parshas Shmini, and it's saying that you should basically sanctify yourselves and be holy and don't be metamri with all the shatim and the dvarim tmeim that we were warned about in Parshas Shmini at the end of Parshas Shmini, and then it segues into Tazir Matera for the next Gemara, which we're going to mention, which is, there is a Gemara in Maseches Shavuos, if I'm not mistaken. And the Gemara Maseches Shavuos says that if a person is mekadosh themselves b'shas tashmish, that is to say while they're having relations, then they will have righteous children, male children, whatever the particular thing that you want to bless the children with is. And the Gemara learns this from the fact that it says at the end of Parashat Shmini, that you should basically sanctify yourself, and immediately following that, it says that Isha says a woman that she will give seed and she will give birth to a male. So you see, there's some connection between having one and Zcharim, which is a favorable attribute that people wanted to have a male son back in the day, so they could pass on their genes. Although it also says that having a first child as a daughter is a good simon for the rest of the kids, etc., etc. But there is a certain idea of having a firstborn son, especially nowadays. People want to have a pidyon haben, not realizing necessarily that pidyon haben is more of a monetary thing, that you don't definitely need to be jollying to have a son, but it's a thing. It's a thing to have. People want to have a pidyon haben. Regardless, I digress. This isn't about the history of wanting male sons versus wanting female daughters, I guess I should say. But ultimately, this is the Gemara in Shavuos. So, with that in mind, maybe you could say that this is the mitzvah of Iskafya, that you should sanctify yourself. Now, I'm sorry, I think I got lost in... Yeah, the Rebbe had a note. The Rebbe said that he thinks that it's Kadeshim, and he doesn't think that it's Parashat Shmini. And he said, and he says that it's a little bit difficult because the Gemara in Yuma is coming off of something else in Parashat Shmini. So when it then quotes the pasuk of Iskafya, saying that you should sanctify yourself a little bit, it would make sense that it's talking about Parashat Shmini, but the Rebbe stands with the idea that it is referring to the V'hiskadishtem that is in Parashat Kadeshim. So with that in mind, you have the Gemara in Shavuos. The Gemara in Shavuos seems to be talking about the idea of Kedushas Tashmish. So I want to talk a little bit about. First, I'll mention just some interesting sources. You have a Sifra of Parashat Kadeshim that says that when it says Kadeshim to you, it's referring to Kedushas Kol Mitzvahs, and V'hiskadishim is referring to separating from Goyim. That's what it is. So essentially, V'hiskadishim is separating from Goyim. Do we take this? I don't know that we necessarily take this to the halacha. I don't know that there's anyone that says that separating from Goyim is the mitzvah of V'hiskadishim. Maybe you could scratch it into something that we're going to say a little bit later. I don't necessarily see that that's how it's understood and appreciated. The Malbim, if I'm not mistaken, does say when he says that it's when the Sifra says that it refers to separating from Goyim, it means like from the ways of Goyim, and not just the ways of Goyim, but it means from separating from things which are more mundane. And is this what the Alter Rebbe is referring to? I don't know. You can take it, you can catch it. It doesn't seem that that's necessarily what the Sifra is trying to intend, and there's also, if I'm not mistaken, some Yalkut Shemenis that say different Lashonis of Akum Goyim, etc., that make it a little bit hard to read in the Malbim's explanation. Again, not arguing with the Malbim Chas v'Shalom, just saying that the idea of saying that this is what people were necessarily referring to in a straightforward way, in a more direct way, as opposed to more of a drashic way, a little bit difficult. Lani Yosaiti. You do have a vart from Rabbeinu Bechaya at the end of Parashat Shmini, and he says, what it's saying over there is that through fulfilling Hashem's mitzvahs, we're less grub, we're less corporeal, if you will. We're less involved and invested in the world. So this you can take it, I guess, and run with it. That's what Kadeshim is. It's a little bit difficult with the Rebbe's note. The Rebbe is trying to push that as Parashat Kadeshim, but at the end of the day, it's something you could take. Is Rabbeinu Bechaya counted as one of the many mitzvahs, or the halachas is necessarily quoting him for halacha? It seems to be more of a drasha. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that the Alter Rebbe is quoting halacha, but it does seem that that's kind of what he's doing over here, in the sense that he's trying to give off that you have an extra advantage and that you're fulfilling a mitzvah say. I also don't know that Rabbeinu Bechaya isn't necessarily even trying to convey that it's mitzvah say. It seems like Rabbeinu Bechaya is just he's giving a drasha. Again, I'm just mentioning all these things for completion's sake. More, it seems to be an interesting point to get a little bit more to the halachic side. There is a Tosfos in Maseches Chulin Daf Beis Amud Beis, and over there Tosfos says that the mitzvah of Iskafya is in general, it's a warning, lava b'mikal asay kind of thing, that a person shouldn't eat food when they shouldn't eat tummy food. That's what it is. Not that they shouldn't eat food while they're tummy, that they shouldn't eat tummy food. There is obviously the exception to this idea, which is when a person is tummy, they're able to eat tummy food, either because they're not included in this mitzvah, if you're already tummy, maybe you're not included, or you could say because the person isn't going to starve just because they're tummy, and today we're all tummy mason, and can you imagine if Klal Yisrael stopped eating because we're all tummy mason, we don't chas v'shalom want to be tummy the food. Elamai, the food is tummy, and we eat tummy food. You can technically speaking eat food without it becoming tummy. It's not impossible to survive without eating food that's tummy. It's just I would say unreasonably difficult, especially to fulfill other mitzvahs, like eating matzah is one of those mitzvahs that would be pretty difficult to eat matzah that isn't shaykh to becoming tummy, because matzah needs to be mixed with water, and at that point it's already mukhshal l'tumah. Most foods, though, you can technically speaking get away with without making a tummy, because you just don't let it touch one of the 7 liquids, and so it would be essentially surviving off of fruit juices and mezainis bread and stuff like that. It's doable. It's not impossible. At the end of the day, not necessarily included in it. And again, that's technically another direction you could run off with what Iskafya is. It would be nice if I could find a way to tie that into the way that I'm going to tie in the last Gemara, which is we're going to get there, and it's pasha. It's a shikul mind-blowing how synergistic we're technically able to make this. What the mitzvah of Iskafya actually is. You have that. You have another Tosfos in Yevamis, that famine base. He brings more of a drasha from Iskafya, Tosfos in 2 different mesechtas. Not necessarily do they agree. It's more of a drasha of K'chasi, the Ma'alim K'chaskim over there. But I digress. It's not overly. There's not like a direction that's necessarily being taken with that Tosfos. So just to summarize right now, we have a bunch of good drashis. We have Tosfos in Maseches Cholin that implies Iskafya is an azhara for eating tummy food. I don't know if Tosfos necessarily stands with that Gemara, with that interpretation, if it's anything halacha l'maisa, but that is a Tosfos. You have a bunch of interesting drashas that we have with it, and we also have the Gemara in Yuma again, which we said is other mekadosh asmai ma'at l'mata, mekadosh shnei and l'maylo. And this is a Gemara that Alter Rebbe says is independent of Iskafya. If it would be the same thing, then it would be a little bit difficult to understand Alter Rebbe, because Alter Rebbe is saying that you have, in addition to the Gemara in Yuma, you also have the concept of Kaddish being an aseh. So it seems to be 2 separate things. You also have the Gemara in Shavuos, which is that you have Klishas Tashmish, and that is a scholar for Barnum Zcharim. So there is a Yereim. The Yereim, firstly, I'll just mention, just to get out of the way, there's Yereim in Siman Ayin Gimel. It seems to imply that it's an inverse of Bal Tashaktu, that the Avera of disgusting yourself, and so Viskadishim is kind of the inverse of that. That's a Yereim Stam. It's not necessarily direct, it's not direct, but it's something that you can read into the Yereim. But you do have another Yereim, and that Yereim is Siman Taf Lamed Daled, mitzvah Taf Lamed Daled, however you want to slice it, and that Yereim says, he references another Gemara in Brachos, but I believe it comes up in a few places actually. Regardless, this Gemara says, it darshans, Viskadishim Visum that Viskadishim is that you should sanctify yourself with mayim rishonim. When you eat food, first you should wash your hands before, and Visum Kadeshim, you should wash your hands afterwards. The Re'im says there is a mitzvah to be holy. The Re'im doesn't say what that mitzvah is. And the Re'im actually says, we don't know what the mitzvah is. There's a mitzvah to be holy, and simply put, we don't know what it is. But he says maybe it has something to do with being neat, because it means that you wash your hands before and you wash your hands after. Yeah, this Gemara and Brachos is making a drasha. So you have this idea that you can say that maybe Taka Vizkilishtem is this mitzvah. It's the idea of being neat. I think we could tie in this Re'im to what we're going to say later. It's a little bit, I'm not going to say it's a little bit difficult per se. The reason why I would call it perhaps a little difficult is because I'll get into the next source and we'll see. Bez Hashem. So you have a Sefer Charedim. Sefer Charedim is formatted in an interesting way. It kind of divides mitzvahs by body part. And so when he gets to the Reisha Geviyah, he first lists the mitzvahs that are a little bit more l'cholei alma, like Bris Milah, things like that. You know, the mitzvahs that you would expect for the Reisha Geviyah. But then he says also, you have Yiskadishtem. Great. Seems to be directly out of Shavuos. you have the Kedusha's attachment in Shavuos, so you see that you have a concept of Kedusha's attachment, and the Gemara in Shavuos is not only saying that you have a reward for Kedusha's attachment, but maybe also you could say is saying that it's a mitzvah. More than that, he also quotes the Ramban on Chumash, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll get to the Ramban on Chumash. Actually, it's actually not so complicated. The Ramban on Chumash basically says in the beginning of Parashat Kedishim that Kaddish Mutadach is a mitzvah and you shouldn't be a menul b'shas Torah. Essentially, is what he says over there. The origin of a lot of these concepts, actually. That is what the Ramban says over there. So the Sefer Charedim brings it by Iskafya, and amongst those that he counts as holding of the mitzvah, and not amongst those, but simply it's actually two. He quotes the Goyin, which I believe is referring to the Bahag, and you also have, he quotes Shlomo ibn Gabriel as the other person who holds of this mitzvah. Shlomo ibn Gabriel is a very interesting character. I don't know if he's come up earlier in shiurim. We definitely hold of him, I would say, because we say his slichos. He wrote slichos for a lot of occasions. He wrote a lot of piyutim. He was mainly known as a Python. The fact that he has a minyan of mitzvahs is because he wrote piyut that we have. It's actually funny because he's Chas v'shalom, chas v'chalila, I'm saying this slightly in jest, but he's one of the greatest philosophers of the Christians, not a Christian philosopher, one of the greatest philosophers of the Christians, because they found a work of his either was translated into Latin already, or they translated it into Latin, but L'maisa, no one knew who it was written by for a great long time, until ultimately, in somewhat recent times, it was shown that it was written by him. I believe it's called Fons Vitae, and it's a theological work, a theological, philosophical work, and it's not particularly descriptive, and so they kind of adopted it for themselves, and it was very influential in Christian philosophy. And yeah, written by one of the rishonim, one of the Paitonim of the rishonim. So Shlomo ibn Gabriel, I'm not referring to him as rabbi, I don't know if there's an official thing in context, but definitely Kaddish Yom. So Shlomo ibn Gabriel and the Bahag are both people that count this mitzvah of Vis Kadishim. So now, I can't say that I know much about Shlomo ibn Gabriel and how you count his mitzvahs, etc., but we can focus a little bit on the Bahag. Now, just to be clear, the reason why I mentioned before that it's a little bit difficult to fit the Yudaim into the whole thrust of what I'm going to try to get to is because you could say that the Yudaim is part of it, but it's also interesting that no one brought up the Yudaim as holding of this vart. The Sefer Charedim, he does list who he believes holds of this idea, and he doesn't list the Yudaim. So I'm gonna have to assume that he doesn't necessarily, but we're gonna have to bear together with this. So again, the Sefer Charedim says the Bahag holds of this. Where's this Bahag? So I have a theory, and you'll have to follow me. It's a little bit like sticking those thumbtacks on a chalkboard, not a chalkboard, on a corkboard, and we're gonna try to tie it all together in a pashut niglah'dike way. In his fourth shiur, if I'm not mistaken, in Sefer HaMitzvahs, when the Rambam is discussing how he decided what counts as a mitzvah say and what doesn't count, the Rambam says a mitzvah klolus doesn't count as a mitzvah say because there's nothing specific. You can look over there. It's not an overly complicated sentiment, and to this sentiment, he quotes an example. He says, "That's a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah." To be holy is a mitzvah. What does it mean? What's the practical? What is Hashem telling us to do? It's vibey. It's a good vibe. Oh yeah, be holy. What does it actually mean to be holy? There's no specific mitzvah. Okay, so you're going to tell me don't go into the base of mikdash while you're tamei. Fine. Don't eat tamei foods while you're tahir. Arguably is Vis Kadishim itself according to Tosfos. We also have like foods like turma is also to eat while it's tamei. It's also to eat turma while you're tamei. And you have all of these things that involve Tumah and Tara and Karbanis and etc., that staying away from Tumah, there's a lot of mitzvahs. The Rambam actually counts a lot of them as mitzvahs, and the Ramban actually is massing on him. How are you counting the Tumah of a Zava as a mitzvah? But regardless, Vis Kadishim, the Bahag does actually count it as a mitzvah. And so the Rambam says, I don't think it should be counted as a mitzvah. I don't understand what the mitzvah of Vis Kadishim is. What, practically speaking, are you telling me to do? Comes the Ramban, and the Ramban in his Esagis, he says, I'm going to defend the Bahag. He says, according to the Bahag, actually, as a matter of fact, there's a specific mitzvah. What's the specific mitzvah? It's the inverse of not eating shatim. Not eating shatim is, it's a mitzvah. It's a lav to eat shatim. And there's an inverse for that. Not necessarily does it need to be an inverse, but the Eibusher does give an inverse. What does it mean, an inverse? it says Kol Behema Tehira Techilu, or something to that effect. I hope I'm not messing any of the details. But Kol Behema Tehira Techilu, you should eat kosher animals. So a person might say, I have a business expense. I need to go now to the butcher shop and buy a lot of kosher meat and have a barbecue tonight because the Abisha told me I need to eat kosher meat. And so instead of putting on tefillin, maybe the person will spend their budget on kosher meat because the Abisha said to eat kosher meat. It's not that Hashem is saying that it's a mitzvah to go out and eat kosher meat. It's the given asay to the loisa say of not eating teifah meat. You're not allowed to eat teifah meat. You're not allowed to eat chazer. So the Abisha said you should eat kosher meat. Not to say that you need to go out of your way to eat kosher meat, but to say that you shouldn't eat chazer. Not only should you not eat chazer, but I'm going to give you a mitzvah to eat the other meat instead of eating the chazer. It's only to add stringency onto the lav of eating a chazer. That's why there's a mitzvah. So the same thing for shratzim. You have a lav to eat shratzim. You're not allowed to eat shratzim. It could be a lot of lavin actually that you incur by eating shratzim. But the Abisha says also that I'm giving a mitzvah, v'yiskadishtem, that you should sanctify yourselves from eating the shratzim. Shratzim have also what to do with tumah. So v'yiskadishtem, v'yiskadishtem, don't eat the shratzim, says the Abisha. So the Ramban says, great, we have our mitzvah. Now you're going to say it's general. Okay, say it's general also. You could say that besides for the fact that it's a mitzvah, there's also a more general aspect. You have this concept that comes up. B'chlal, you have the idea of a general mitzvah. It comes up in a few places. One example that comes to mind is the certain offshoots of Zerayu of Arayis that the Rambam says that even though you have a mitzvah according to the Rambam Deiraisa, of separating, of leisikruvu, to not come close to Arayis, according to the Rambam is Deiraisa, according to the Rambam is Rabbanan, but according to the Rambam at least it's Deiraisa. So he says there's another aspect of Deiraisa, it says Ma'aseh Mitzrayim. What's Ma'aseh Mitzrayim? He gives a list of things. He says that in general you don't get malchus for it, and one of the reasons that he lists is because it's a lav shebecholos. Lav shebecholos you don't get malchus on. It's not that Ma'aseh Mitzrayim is necessarily its own thing, and I believe that he brings Ma'aseh Mitzrayim in Sefer HaMitzvahs. I could be fact-checked, but I believe that he brings Ma'aseh Mitzrayim in Sefer HaMitzvahs by leisikruvu. It's part of leisikruvu. It's in the same pasha. It's why it's part and parcel. Elamai. It's too general. It's too general to actually get malchus for. But the actual specifics of leisikruvu, which is a thing that's discussed in Siman Kuf Tzaddik Hey, and in other places, Ayin Sham, Siman Kuf Tzaddik Hey in Yeridea, that is. So the specifics of leisikruvu, betach, a person could get malchus for it. It's not too vague, but the ideas of Ma'aseh Mitzrayim are too vague according to the Rambam, so it can't incur malchus. But anyhow, I'm going to digress from that. Ultimately, you have the idea of a lav that it has a specific aspect, and it can still be counted as one of the mitzvahs. So now it's interesting. The Rambam is not necessarily arguing with the Rambam's sheresh. He does seem to agree that a general mitzvah like that you can't count, and it really does make sense to a large extent. who am I to throw my hat into the ring? My point is that I hear the point. It's not like my point is that the Ramban is not. He's not arguing with the Rambam in the general aspect. What he is he's defending the Bahag. The Bahag says the Iskafya is a mitzvah, and the Rambam is interpreting for the Bahag how you're able to say that Iskafya is a mitzvah. So now I want to move on to a Gemara I've been saving for last, which is the Gemara in Yevamos Daf Chaf, if I'm not mistaken. And the Gemara in Yevamos Daf Chaf, essentially, very interesting Gemara. It says you have the mitzvah of Yibum. If a person passes away, he has a wife, he has no kids, he has brothers that were around by the time that he passed away. So there's a mitzvah that the brother should marry the wife of his deceased brother. The brother-in-law, I guess I should say, should become the husband. So this is the mitzvah. Now it's possible to have in a multiple way. It's possible to have in a multiple way that a man is married to a mamzeres, right? Let's say Reuven marries a mamzeres. Before he could have kids, he's living in sin, just to make things simple, not to need to complicate things. Marries a mamzeres, he passes away, has no kids. Shimon is an upstanding Jew. He's not interested in being with a mamzeres if it's usher, but if it's mutter, he doesn't care. He's just interested in doing the right thing. So the question is he allowed to marry with a mamzeres? So we answer that he's not. The question is why. The Gemara is trying to understand why. So the Gemara says, well, there's a mitzvah of Iskafya. There's a mitzvah of sanctifying yourself, and so the mitzvah of sanctifying yourself should combine with the avera of marrying a mamzeres. and it should make that you're not allowed to consummate the marriage, or to consummate the levirate marriage. They have some fancy English translation with a mamzeres. This is what the Gemara says, and then the Gemara says ultimately that we don't mess around with shit like this. Why? Because Iskafya applies to the whole Torah. Iskafya applies to the whole Torah. What do you mean? You're trying to tell me Iskafya that it should apply also to the lav of mamzeres. Okay, so say that Iskafya also applies to the mitzvah of yibum. So now you'll have two mitzvahs to say of yibum and Iskafya, and that should cancel out. One mitzvah should knock out the mitzvah say of Iskafya versus Iskafya, and then yibum versus mamzeres. And usually we say anaseh beats leisaseh. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say Iskafya is only going to fight for the side of anti-mamzeres, and that it's not going to fight for the side of yibum. So that's what the Gemara says over there. Now, Tosfos actually has an interesting way of slicing the Gemara. Tosfos says about the beginning of the Gemara, that when you ask the question, it says Iskafya. So he's saying the Gemara wants that you should say of Iskafya to both sides. The Gemara is playing it in the inverse. The Gemara is saying that you should have yibum. Yibum is an asay. You should have mamzeres. Mamzeres is a lav. Then you have Iskafya on both sides. Iskafya about yibum, and you have Iskafya about mamzeres. And then it should be two asays versus an asay and a lois asay. Now, in general, we say asay deich lois asay. We say asay and lois asay are not pushed away by an asay. We say about Yom Tov, for example, about, let's say, Tekiyah Shefer. You have different rules like these. Tosfos is saying that two asays shouldn't push away an asay and a lois asay. So what it should be is that the answer is no. And the answer is no because you have two asays and a lois asay and an asay, and ultimately it doesn't push it away. The two asays of Iskafya and yibum shouldn't push away the mamzeres and Iskafya. Then the Gemara comes and it asks similar question. But you should say this also you should ruin every asay and lois asay. And it's because it says Iskafya. So every time that you have an asay and a lois asay, you should say it actually doesn't end up beating it. Why? Because Iskafya pushes it away. So ultimately, Rav gives his answer. I want to focus. There's a very interesting line of reasoning you can take if you focus on. There's a Tosfos rishonim. Tosfos rishonim says that when the Gemara answers, it says by the entire Torah. When the Gemara pushes away, I should say that it says Iskafya for the whole Torah. It says over there that at the end of the Gemara, I guess it's another Gemara I've been holding back. I'm sorry, I've been holding back a lot of Gemaras. Hopefully we're going to be over this soon enough. In Mesachas Bava Metzia, there is a Gemara, and that Gemara says about Iskafya. And that's really where Iskafya is about. That's really the Asay of Iskafya. Everything else, Taka, there's an Asay of Iskafya. It is a general mitzvah. Elamai. It happens to be that you can't count it for Asay of Deichalis Asay. It's taka part of the mitzvah, but you can't count it. You can only count it in the meat of what the mitzvah is. So you can't count all of the side points that are included with it as part of the mitzvah. But really, it should be taka a mitzvah to say. So that's what Tosfos rishonim is saying over here. So, what's this Gemara above Messiah? So it says that Ravina went on a trip, and Rav Chanina from Surah asked Ravina. It says Yitzias Mitzrayim by Shotim, which is the pasuk that says Yisklishim and I am Hashem and I took you out of Mitzrayim, etc. So he says, what's the reason why it says it? So he says, Ravina says that Hashem is saying about this mitzvah, I am the one that I distinguished between the tipa of a bechira and the tipa of someone that's not a bechira by Yitzias Mitzrayim. I will take vengeance from someone that mixes in the intestines of non-kosher fish into the intestines of kosher fish, and I sell them to a yid, and sells them to a yid. So Hashem is essentially saying, you have a person, they make taravas. You're going to have to bear with me here for a second. This is really, we're going to tie this all together, Hashem. You have the notion of a person that he has kosher fish intestines, and he says, I want to bump the profits a little bit, so he buys at a discount non-kosher fish intestines. He mixes it into the kosher fish intestines. B'chlal, the fish intestines were somewhat sought after ingredient for making foods like garum back in the day. And so he mixes it in, and he sells it to a Jew. So Hashem says, I'm going to take vengeance from this person. A very specific case is what he's saying over here. But this is what Ravina says, is why it mentions Yis Mitzrayim by the pasuk of Iskafya. So the Gemara continues a little bit with the conversation, but this is the gist of Ad Kan L'Inyanenu. This is what we need for what we're saying. Now, this is a very interesting mitzvah. Why? Because there's a conversation about this in general concept. Min HaTorah, are you allowed to take something that you're not allowed to cook it, knowing that it's going to be batal? Ground zero for this conversation is the El Nazir, that you have the shake of an El Nazir, that you're supposed to cook it with the entire El Nazir, even though it is going to the Kohen. Now, a Yisrael is not allowed to eat from the El Nazir portion that goes to the Kohen. Sorry, not the shake, the Zerei B'Sheila. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Usually shake is given from most karbanis. From the El Nazir, the Zerei B'Sheila is specifically given to the Kohen, and it is cooked with the rest of it, and it is lifted after it is cooked. Now, the Zerei B'Sheila is to the Kohen, and it is not, you're not allowed to eat. Yisrael is not allowed to eat from the Kohen. However, you get the Yisrael gets the rest of the animal, and he's supposed to eat it. How is he able to eat it? So you have the back and forth in the Gemara, and it goes back and forth in the rishonim. It's a big conversation. Ultimately, there's the idea. Either, so definitely in this case, you're allowed to be mevatalis of the chatchila. Take, you shouldn't be allowed to. Elamai, there's enough flavor in the rest of the animal versus the zerei b'sheva, and so we say that it's batal. The question is the Torah telling you over here that technically speaking, deraisa, you're allowed to pull such a stunt? Now, the Rabbanon, you definitely shouldn't, but deraisa, you're allowed to pull such a stunt. Or is it that no, this is a specific case. In this case, it's a mitzvah. This is part of how it's done. But in another case, you're not allowed to do it. And Adrab, the fact that the Torah had to be matered over here is saying that really you're not allowed to do it in other cases. And it's such a chiddush that the Torah has to tell you explicitly that this is how it's done over here. So this is a conversation in the rishonim. It's a much bigger stretch to say. It is an opinion that's out there. It's a much bigger stretch to say that once a person already was mevatel the isur l'chatchila, that there's a knas that they're not allowed to eat the food afterwards. There's a knas that they're not allowed to eat the food afterwards. To say that you're going to pull it to such an extent is really far-fetched. To say that you're going to pull it to such an extent, d'oraisa, much bigger stretch. To say that you're going to pull it to such an extent, d'oraisa, even if you're feeding it to another person, there's a conversation. If you know someone's a mamzer and someone else is getting married to them, are you allowed to just be quiet? Because technically, technically, once the mamzer is mixed into regular society, there's no way of marrying them. So, are you allowed to let them get mixed into society? Are you allowed to intentionally turn a blind eye? Not that you're going to be in the Masada Kedushin. You just don't say anything. Don't pipe up. Arla is something that you're not allowed to eat from it in Chutz La'aretz if you know that. If you know that it's from, if you know that a piece of fruit is taka arla in Chutz La'aretz, you're not allowed to eat from it. If you have this slightest shadow of a suffix, you're allowed to eat it. So the question is, are you allowed to feed arla to someone else in Chutz La'aretz? And by the way, this is halacha l'mishim sinai. It's not just a gzera derabanan. So the question is, are you allowed to feed arla from Chutz La'aretz to someone else? They have no idea. They don't know about it. You know that it's arla. So the Alter Rebbe, if I'm not mistaken, actually in Hilchas Dalin Minim, says that an esrog of arla, technically b'diavad, maybe you could use it. He says you could rely on this opinion. Why? Because even though we don't necessarily hold like this opinion, but an esrog of arla is possible because you're not able to eat it. But technically speaking, the other guy is able to eat it. So you have a lot of ideas that something could even be, technically speaking, a teifet taros. But technically speaking, you're able to feed it to someone else even. To say that d'oraisa, it's so bad to mix in, to be mevatel l'isur l'chatchila, that you're not even able to feed it to the next guy, is a really, really, really big stretch. It's a really, really big stretch. So to say that this Gemara is taka saying d'oraisa, not just the Eibusher saying that that the person is being not doing the proper thing. To say that it's taka asur is a massive, massive stretch. But you can look at it like this. I mean, firstly, you can say it's a say, etc., etc. Not necessarily that it's like an Isser Lav. Maybe it feels a little bit better. At the end of the day, it's still a massive stretch to say that it's Pasha Deiraisa Asr to mix it in. Why am I saying that it's such a stretch? Because it's not even feeding him, based on what the Gemara is saying, it's not even feeding him treif. Because technically speaking, Chadra today is something is bottle. That is to say that if you have a 2-to-1 ratio, that basically a majority of kosher, and you have a minority of not kosher, technically speaking, Deiraisa, don't take this to your butcher store, or don't take this to the Teifa butcher store, I should say. But technically speaking, chadut teres batal. I would say a classic example: if you have 2 packages of chopped meat or 3 packages of chopped meat, 2 of them are from the kosher butcher store, 1 of them is from a not kosher butcher store. Let's say you know that it's from a not kosher butcher store. It gets mixed around, and you don't know which one is which. They were open, they were put into place, etc., etc. You can't identify them. Technically speaking, just don't cook them together, because then there's flavor maybe getting mixed in, etc., etc. But ultimately, just eating it, it's fine. Deraisa, and not only deraisa, but possibly even derabanan. But I don't want to start making general statements on this in this shiur, because it's very easy to make a mistake in comparing different cases. But ultimately, this is the idea. Seemingly, deraisa, it's not even usher to eat this mixture. He's selling it to a Jew. Fine. It's really, really a big stretch to say that it's Pashat also deraisa. But you can still make it. You can still say that this is Iskafya. What does it seem to be, according to Tosfos Rishonim, that he's taking this concept and he's saying somehow this has what to do with Yibum. What does it have to do with Yibum? The mitzvah of Iskafya somehow has to do with Yibum. So seemingly, what you could say is that Iskafya is coming to tell you to not be a manurul b'shus hatera. And this is really who we're getting. We're here to support the Ramban. The Ramban is saying in Parshas Kedishim, in his Pirush, the Kedishim to you, and also his Kedishim later, is saying don't be a manurul b'shus hatera. To not be a manurul b'shus hatera is seemingly a mitzvah to say. And you can connect to this Gemara in Yavamis. Why? Because on both sides, there's a problem. It's not b'shus hatera, but it's being a manurul. And so with marrying a mamzeres, you have the idea of that it's being a manurul in a lot of different ways, but one way that comes to mind is that you're saddling the kid with the fact that it's going to be virtually impossible for them to get married. Well, they're supposed to get lucky, their brother's supposed to die, and they're supposed to, it doesn't even work in such a case unless they only have daughters, whatever. Anyhow, I digress. It's not a good thing to saddle a kid with. It's a niglah'dike thing to saddle a kid with. She's getting a little bit long. We're going to try to keep it to 40 minutes, hopefully. And as far as Yibum, it's the idea of l'hakim shem l'achiv, to not do that. You could also say it's a little bit of a niglah'dike thing to do. You talk about mitzvah of chalitza, but you have the conversation in the Gemara, and not only in the Gemara, it also goes to rishonim about what is the proper one to lead with. Should you prefer to do chalitza, or should you prefer to do yibum? Ultimately, we side with the idea that it's preferred to do chalitza in a practical sense, day to day. It's a little bit awkward, especially in the 21st century, to have such an arrangement. At the end of the day, there are definitely opinions that yibum is the thing to do lechatchila. So you have this idea of Iskafya, you can play it on both sides. And you can say for the entire Torah, in every mitzvah, there's going to be something good that is accomplished with the mitzvah. And so it would be a little bit of a niglah'dike thing to not do it. And over here, maybe the food is kosher, maybe even you're feeding it to your friend and they don't know about it, etc., right? Or you're selling it to your friend, right? Because you're a Jew, you got to make $1. At the end of the day, it's a niglah'dike thing to do, to take Isser and to try to be mevatel, to try to make an extra buck off of it, selling it in a way that no Jew would want to eat such a mixture. I'm not going to say no Jew, but from a default, a Jew isn't interested in eating the intestines of teifa fish. And so you mix it into a sauce, and at the end of the day, the person doesn't know any better, so you're doing it. It's a niglah'dike thing to do. That is the Ramban. You could say that the Ramban, when he says the opinion of the Bahag, that it's about Shatzim, you could say firstly because he wanted to avoid this whole conversation, because it's easier to just say that it's really referring to Shatzim and Zehu. You have the Dasha and the Gemara, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to say that ultimately it has to do with Shatzim. And it's the pashtus of the pasuk that it's referring to Shatzim, and you shouldn't be telling me with all of the Shatzim. It's straight in the pasuk. So you can say that the Ramban is just going with that more straightforward thing. But ultimately, the idea of Iskafya, if you would take this, would be not just for not eating Shatzim, you could say the idea of being a menuvel. The idea of being a menuvel, according to the Bahag. You get Tanya, this is what it is. According to Tosfos Rishonim, when the Tosfos Rishonim says that he connects it to this Gemara Bava Metzia, assuming the Tosfos Rishonim is Taka saying that Iskafya is this is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to not be a menuvel, and part of being menuvel is to be mevatel the lechatchila. So you can tell that it's maybe even also deraisa to be mevatel the lechatchila, and that part of the iser of being mevatel the lechatchila is taka to prava Iskafya, because to eat like a glutton and to just eat without being cognizant of the fact that you need to do everything in order to serve the Eibishter is also being a menuvel b'shus hatera, and this is that's a lot more directly in line with what the Ramban is referring to in his commentary on Chumash. Now that we have arrived here, it's a little bit tough, because however I want to slice it, it seems to be when the Rebbe says that it's referring to Parshas Kedishim, it seems to be that he's referring to this idea of the Ramban. If you want to say this whole day that I have about the Kirvei Dogim having what to do with not being a Menuvel B'Shus HaTorah, it's a little bit hard to say it over there. The Ramban doesn't comment on Parsha Shmini. Parsha Shmini is again where you have the idea of Shatim, and the Gemara is explicit that it's about Shatim. So it doesn't really fit in with that whole thing. You could tie the Ramban, and you could tie the Ramban is saying another Vizkadishim is a general mitzvah, and Kaddish Chatzach Motzulach. And Alter Rebbe says to say, I don't know. And the Rebbe leaves it as a tzarachin. I don't mind leaving it as a tzarachin either. I don't need to have an answer for the Rebbe's questions. And L'chal said I'm very hesitant to give answers to the Rebbe's questions. But you can find out that that's what the Alter Rebbe is referring to. And this would could be a different concept. It's his own asay, the idea of not being a Menuvel B'Shus HaTorah. It not necessarily is to say that Iskafya V'Sim Kedeshim is not also a concept of being holy, and like the Gemara in Yuma says, etc., etc. You have the Reim, and the Reim counts it also, and he counts it from the Bahag as being a mitzvah for Reisha Kabir. And so if you're going to take this, sorry, not the Reim, the Charedim, you have the Charedim, and it says that. And if you're going to take that from the Charedim, which you can take it from the Charedim, then you could say that this is what the Bahag is referring to when he says the general mitzvah of Iskafya V'Sim Kedeshim, and he would say that the Gemara is directly shouting it out in Masech HaShvus as being an application. As far as why particularly that, there's other ways you could also have it. Okay, you could say it's a more direct application, etc., etc. Ultimately, my point in this is that in Parak Chav Zayin, you have seemingly two different things that are counted, and that's the way that it's framed. That you have Mekadosh Shas Ma'at L'mato, Mekadosh Nesei Harbim L'maylo, and this is besides for Mekadosh Shas Ma'chomot. In Parak Lamed, though, you have a little bit of a more interesting phrasing, which is that you have other seemingly mundane things. The Alter Rebbe says that it's midiraisa, and first he says Kadishim Tiyu and Vizkadishtem. Seemingly, you gotta say over there that he's referring to this concept. Again, Vizkadishtem, is it the later Vizkadishtem or the early Vizkadishtem? It's a little bit difficult to say. Ultimately, it seems to be that it could be a concept of deraisa. Is it counted as one of the 613? According to the Bahag, maybe. And according to the other Marina mitzvahs, no. Are we going to say that it makes a difference for him, or it could just be an asay d'chlolos, like Rashi says in Chumash that there's he says about the pasuk. It says v'chai b'hem. It says in that you should guard my statutes, mishpatai tasu, etc. And the Rambam says, Rashi says that it's to give an asay for a chukin also, because you don't have an asay given for chukin, etc., etc. So ultimately, this entire concept, whether it's an assay or not an assay, is definitely a concept that I saw. And yeah, we should live with it. L'chaim v'lebracha.